Frank Mahovlich. Here's Beliveau closing in. He scores! John Beliveau getting his second in a row.
Hockey Inside Out, presented to you by The Gazette.
Welcome to a special episode of the Hockey Inside Out show as we look back on the life and times of Jean Beliveau and celebrate the man he was both on and off the ice. I have Mr. Dick Irvin, who needs no introduction, Ron Roosh, Michael Farber. Dick, do you remember the first time you saw Jean Beliveau, your first memory of him?
April of 1951, he was playing for the Quebec Citadels. And I was, at that particular time, I was a student at the University of Saskatchewan, and my dad and mother were here. And I flew down from Saskatoon to Montreal to join them to drive back to Regina. That was my first airplane ride. I was 19 years old. And exactly the week before, on a Saturday night, Bill Barilko had scored the famous goal that now we're on our way back west, and we go to the junior hockey game between the Quebec Citadels and the Barrie Flyers. Turned out to be the last game of the Eastern Memorial Cup Championship. Barrie eliminated Quebec that night and went on to play in the final. So Big Jean is the big story, of course. And we were seated in amongst a whole bunch of Barrie fans, and of course they knew that Dick Irvin, coach of the Canadiens, was sitting right there. And of course they really took advantage of talk about the Quebec team, yell, and they were awful with Beliveau. Awful stuff that they were hollering at him, you know. And my mother, this is true, she finally turned around the guy behind us, who was the yappiest guy of all, and hit him over the head with her program. And you know, the guy didn't say anything after that for a while. And finally, he said, "Well, Beliveau, you'll never be another Rocket Richard." And that's all he said for the rest of the game. She hit him. I was so embarrassed. She got fed up with this guy. Good for her.
They got hammered that night, didn't they?
Yeah, they lost quite badly.
8-2 or something.
Yeah,
and that game, Conn Smythe said after that guy, the guy's never going to make it. You know, somebody said to him, the Belivau's the next thing and everything up. Nah, I wouldn't have him.
And that's why they should rename the Conn Smythe Trophy to Jean Beliveau.
He was the first guy to win it.
Now, Michael, did you see Jean play live? What was your first memory?
I cannot recall him. I'm just meeting him here in Montreal, and I find it's amazing that since Jean Belivau's death, we've been talking about his career after hockey, as much as we've talked about hockey. Yeah, we talked about the 10 Stanley Cups as a player, 5 as captain, but mostly we've talked about the man. And if you build a Mount Rushmore, the greatest players in the game, Bobby Orr will talk about his skating and how he reinvented the game, or the Mother's Day goal in 1970. And if we talk Gordie Howe, we'll talk about longevity, or maybe a Gordie Howe hat trick. If it's Mario Lemieux, we'll talk about a goal he scored. Or if it's Gretzky, we'll talk about numbers. With Jean Beliveau, we've talked about the way a man has lived his life.
Now, did he make the Canadiens great, or did the Canadiens help make Jean Beliveau great, Dick?
Well, he was a great young hockey player when he joined the team, but he joined a Stanley Cup winning team, don't forget. They'd won the Cup in 1953. And Jean come up that year and played the 3 games that they used to do and scored 5 goals. But, you know, the Canadiens had a great team. I mean, the next 2 years, he won 10 Stanley Cups, and the first 2 years of his career, he got to Game 7 of the finals both times, and lost, and once in overtime. So that he was 2 wins away from 12 Stanley Cups as a player, you know. So no, Montreal had a wonderful hockey team then. They had the Rocket and Elmer and Bouchard and a young Bernie Geoffrion and a young Dickie Moore, and Jacques Plante had just arrived. He was a great young hockey player who joined a pretty great hockey team.
Ron, what do you remember most about him as a player that made him so great?
Well, I always talk about, two of the greatest games, the individual performances that I remember. One was the Lafleur game in Game 7 of the Too Many Men in the Ice game. But I remember vividly that 71 second game of the Boston series when they were down 5-1, and Beliveau literally took that game over. I think he assisted on the first goal of the game, and then but when that comeback and the win, which actually propelled him to a monstrous upset over Boston in that series. That was his last year. He retired right after that. But if you're going to go out, you go out with, with a performance like that. You say, you know.
Well, that year, he led all playoff performers with assists. I can't remember anything specific he did in the Chicago series, except totally outplay Stan Mikita. And the Chicago coach was dumb enough to keep putting Mikita out against Beliveau. Really, I could never figure that out. And Al McNeil loved it because he just put Jean out every time. So that game, Henry Richard scored a goal late in the second period to make it 5-2. And in the third period, I think Jean got a goal and 2 assists. He set Fergie up for 2 goals, scored one himself. And you're right, he totally took over. He turned back the counter that night, and that was his last hurrah as an individual game. But he continued to play well through the whole playoffs. Obviously, more assists than anybody else in the league.
His 47-goal season, I remember talking to Doug Harvey one time, and Doug, I said, what happened? I mean, he was, 22 goals? What did he have? He had 30 goals the year before, I think. He had injured the first year, and then all of a sudden, 47 goals, the greatest year. And he says he got tough. He started, he got mean. Now, the NHL record at that time, I think Red Horner held it 167 minutes in penalties. Jean had 143 minutes in penalties that year after only 22 the year before. So, I mean, he just got to the point where people were really beating him up, and he finally just said, that's it. Just almost in the same way that Larry Robinson, when he came into the league, just fought his way through the first couple of years, and then everybody let him alone. And I guess that was the rest of his career. Nobody went near him anymore.
Now, Michael, you were talking about how his off-ice stories from the last 40-odd years. You were mentioning to me you actually have a picture of Jean Beliveau up in your home.
We've had since 2002. It's in our foyer, along with pictures of our children and our granddaughter. And he was almost like family in some sense. He was very helpful to me. I mean, we shared a cancer, and he went through his, a little more than a decade before I did, but when I was undergoing treatment, he was encouraging. He would call and check on me. But you know what? There are 1,000 people in this city with stories just like mine. I mean, I'm not different, I'm not special, because this is how Beliveau lived his life. Abraham Lincoln once called it the better angels of our nature. Did I get that right? And this is what Beliveau was. I mean, the better angels of our nature.
I came into Montreal in '66, and he was one of those guys who would, a new guy in the room and everything else. I'd never lived in Montreal. I'd been in Europe for 5 years at that point. And it was the same thing, And CBS had named the team of the year that year, '66. And so Win Elliott, who was the broadcaster down in New York, phoned me and said, "Well, you get some interviews with these guys." In those days, first of all, Toe hated tape machines. He just hated them. He didn't want them around.
You guys with your black boxes.
and so no tape machines in the dressing room in those days. And so I went to the PR and I said, "Look, CBS wanted to say, okay, I'll talk to Big Jean." So I went to Jean, and I had to stand outside the dressing room with this clumsy big box and wait. And out would come Claude Provost. Big Jean tells me, "I have to talk to you." One after the other, they're coming out doing an interview, and finally Gump Worsley came out, and I said, "What's going on in there anyway?" And he says, Big John just got up and said, "This is an honor. We should all do this." And in those days, Hockey Night in Canada was paying the guys, and so they wanted money to do radio as well. I mean, it's a different era, but he said we should do it for nothing. Okay, Gump, thank you. Thank Jean for me.
We'll be back after a short break, and we'll share some more Jean Beliveau stories. Welcome back to the Hockey Inside Out Show. Dick, do you have a favorite personal memory or story of Jean Beliveau you can share?
Well, there's a lot of them, Stu, really. But in 1996, the Canadiens played the Rangers in the playoffs. I think it was the last time they played them in the playoffs until last year. And I was doing the game at Madison Square Garden, and we weren't up in the regular broadcast booth. There had been a basketball game that afternoon, umpteen basketball playoff game, umpteen broadcast a hockey game. So they had built a kind of a stand at one end of the rink, and that's where Hockey Night Canada ended up. So the game is just about to begin, and I see people down below me standing up. Suddenly people in this one section, everybody's standing up and applauding. Who's this? Got to be a Broadway star, a Hollywood movie star, you know, heaven forbid a politician. Somebody was getting a big ovation, and I couldn't see because everybody was standing up. Then they start to sit down with Jean Beliveau.
Wow.
He was coming to his seat for a hockey game in New York 25 years after he'd played his last game, and there they were. That's, to me, I'll always remember that.
Well, a couple of years ago for TSN, I was interviewing Ted Lindsay. And we were talking about the Detroit Red Wings game in Marquette Prison in 1954.
Ted Lindsay was the toughest guy.
Yeah, pretty much. And so at the end of it, I just mentioned Jean Beliveau. He stood up. Out of camera, he stood up. And I'm saying, well, what's this? He says, well, whenever somebody mentions Mr. Belivau's name, I stand up out of respect. This is terrible Ted Lindsay. And I told this story to Mark Napier, former Canadien, who's now involved with the NHL Alumni Association. He says, you know, it's funny. I call Ted Lindsay Ted, although I should probably call him Mr. Lindsay. I call Bobby Orr Bobby. And I call Mr. Beliveau Mr. Beliveau.
Yes.
Bobby Hull told me a story one time I thought was quite funny. He says in his second year in the league, which would be about, 1957 or so, and he at Chicago Stadium, he went into the corner against Beliveau and went in and threw a really good elbow at him. Boom, smacked. And Beliveau came off the boards, and he turned around to Bobby and he says, Bobby, I'm disappointed in you. Hall says I felt about that small.
That reminds me of that line where he said, I think it was one of your Sports Illustrated colleagues writing that he looked like God with a $500 haircut.
Yeah, Steve Russian. I mean, Beliveau was everything we aspire to be. He was a winner, competitive as all get out, compassionate, bilingual, and like Dick Irvin, incredibly handsome.
Now, people knew so much about him, Dick. Is there anything about Jean people might be surprised to know? Or
No, I don't know. He was such a public person. And I think that's why we're seeing now the outpouring from all over, because Jean was always there. He right from the day he retired. And remember, Ron, you and I were there the day he retired, and we were there the next day when Guy Lafleur was drafted. I mean, it was one after the other. But in the case of Maurice Richard, he would, like one time he got a big mat on against the hockey team. He went years without even going to a game. Ronald Corey brought him back into the fold. So the Rocket was here, but not there. And, John was always present, From one, I'd go with the Canadiens to, like, say, to Vancouver. Oh, Jean Beliveau was here last week. Oh, was he? Oh, go to Calgary. Oh, Jean Beliveau was here 2 weeks ago. Oh, you could find, doing things, appearing at charities, hospitals, whatever. He was all over the place.
And maybe the best thing he ever did was never be general manager of the Montreal Canadiens, because that's grubby. You're going to make trades, you're going to hire coaches, you're going to fire coaches, and you put yourself in the firing line. And Beliveau, Ron, never had to do that.
No. By the way, you're talking about the pictures. He was the first hockey player to appear on the cover of Sports Illustrated.
That's right.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite personal memory of Jean or a story?
Well, actually, it was one of those road trips. Remember when we used to do games only on weekdays, and
when we started, CBC Radio was doing Sundays.
And Dick sent me out on a West Coast trip, and I was in Oakland. He was on that road trip with his daughter on a road trip, and I thought, it was kind of a father-daughter trip, and geez, it was really nice. But we were in Oakland. Oakland. I mean,
the Golden Seals.
Well, all 3,000 people in the building. But Beliveau walked in that place and autographs and everything else. I mean, it was, he was just known everywhere. Take a look at the newspapers, the tributes in places like Florida and Arizona and everything else about Beliveau. People have never seen him play or anything else. It's just an amazing thing to me.
Now, Dick, there's that famous 1953 photo of Jean Beliveau signing his first contract with the Canadiens. Frank Selke, the GM, and your dad in the background doing this. What did your dad tell you about Jean?
Well, if you take a look at that picture closely and you look at Jean, he's pudgy. He doesn't look like, and I take a close look. He's got what had happened was that summer he and Elise were married. And he took the summer off. I mean, he just had a real summer holiday, you see. Showed up at training camp, not in good shape at all. They're negotiating heavily with him. My dad didn't want to whip him into shape like he might have one of his own guys who showed up that way. So he took it easy on him during the training because he didn't want Beliveau to say, I don't need this stuff. It's too bad I can go back to Quebec City, you see. So now they sign him the morning of the All-Star game, which used to be the first game. So now he's under their control. And my dad, he really put him through his paces for the next quite a while. And they used to have those rubber
sweatsuits
to make them lose. He made them skate after the practice. And you don't think that there were some tough guys, Rocca, Delmer Locke, Doug Harvey. They didn't make it easy for him either, I'm pretty sure, and I remember when all was said and done, and John told me one time, he said, your dad did exactly the right thing. He said, I wasn't in shape, I couldn't keep up. Like when he got to the training camp. But what my father always talked about then was the fact that John never complained. Never gave a sideway glance as if, what do you make me do this for? He did it. He did everything he was told to do. That told my dad something about the kind of a pro he was going to be.
And that contract he signed was a 5-year contract with a total of $105,000.
Including bonuses.
We'll be back after a short break and we'll continue our look back on Jean Beliveau, the man and the hockey player. Welcome back to this special episode of the Hockey Inside Out show as we look back on Jean Belivau's life. Michael, one of the things that's really struck me since his death is just the emotions of his former teammates. Yvon Cornway almost unable to speak. There's just the impact it had on them.
For most of us, he was either a friend, a friendly uncle, a grandfather, or a father figure. Well, he was something else to the people he played with. And he was universally admired because he was one of these players who didn't think of himself. I mean, you guys watched him. I mean, he made people around him better. He was a selfless captain, and the outpouring of affection that we've seen in what went on at the Bell Center on Sunday and Monday with people streaming past, and of course, there's the family greeting everyone for 8 hours on 2 consecutive days. It was felt on a different level by his teammates.
Now with Elise Beliveau, I mean, it's remarkable the way she greeted everyone. Did you know her well, Dick? Or?
Well, but I've known Elise, and I give them full marks for what they did. It was just really something. That was unexpected, I would think, but boy, that's quite a performance. It reminded me of Marlene Jeffrion and their daughter Linda, who were with Boom Boom when he passed away early in the morning on a Saturday morning in Atlanta. And at 7 o'clock that night, they were standing at center ice because that was the schedule. He was scheduled to have, the number was scheduled for retirement that night. And there they were. And again, I thought that was so courageous of them to do that, to show up. That was.
There are about, 3.3 million people in the Montreal area. I would venture to say that 80% of the people in some way or the other have had contact with Jean Beliveau, either personally or peripherally or whatever. I mean, he was just. I don't think of a politician
Coderre.
Coderre's
working on it.
Yeah,
he is working on it.
Well, Guy Lapointe said he didn't know the word no. I remember the first time I saw Beliveau was in that exchange program bringing kids from the West to Quebec and vice versa. And I remember him standing signing autographs, and I was looking sort of in awe, and he ran out of ink in his pen, and he just pulled another pen out of his coat and just kept going. It was like nothing, it was like incredible.
One of the things he told me, he was always a little bit surprised but very gratified by his reception outside of Quebec. Because sometimes this is a very insular place, and yes, we all know Jean Beliveau in Quebec City. We all know Jean Beliveau in Montreal, throughout the province. But he didn't fully grasp, I think, at some point, how beloved he was across the country. And when he'd go to Calgary or Regina or Vancouver, it was like he was going across the Champlain Bridge.
I received an email this week from a university professor saying he was thinking they should teach a course, what would Jean Beliveau do?
Yeah.
In sort of life lessons, and it's something that really you have to think about.
It's an interesting question.
Yeah, exactly. Now, as a captain of the team, Ron, you were around the team then. What made him a good captain? What did the players think?
He was not one of those guys, I think, from everything I heard from players, that would stand up and lecture his guys or anything else. He was one of those quiet leader types that just had it. Whether he wanted it or not, people, I think, looked to Jean for help. And he was one of those guys, apparently, if you had a problem, even personal problems, you went to Jean. It was like almost a priest,
Well, I can recall talking to players from that team in the 60s, the team that Toe Blake said was very underrated. Toe Blake was the coach. But when you talk to players years later about what happened and reminisce, well, Big Jean said this, Big Jean did that. It was Big Jean that they talked about as to what things that happened, and he was the catalyst there.
It just echoes what I was saying about my first dealings with him.
Yeah, that's
Big
right.
Jean. Big Jean told me to come out here.
Now, as a generation of younger Canadiens fans grow up, Michael, they're going to ask, they're going to see, who was Jean Beliveau? What would you say to a younger generation?
Interesting question, Stu. We look at, we bifurcate someone, and with a guy like Steve Yzerman, you look at the first 10 years of his career when he's one kind of player, and then a defensive player the second half. Well, with Beliveau, we do it, Beliveau the player and Beliveau the man. And as I was waiting in line with my wife to pay our respects on Sunday, there were people around, and I was talking to one man who brought fairly young children. And I said, well, why are you here? He said, because this was the guy we admired, even though he was too young to have seen Beliveau and his kids. So we have told our children about the kind of person he was. So in addition to the 507 goals, was that it? Yeah, I mean, there is another part of Beliveau. I know when the Hockey News ranked him, Dick, 7th all-time in the late 90s, you thought that was way too low.
Well, I didn't think that too much until I talked to Glenn Hall, who one of the greatest goalies of all time, who was obviously head-to-head with Jean many times. And he's the one who said to me he should have been higher than that. He thought Beliveau was as good as he ever played against,
And Johnny Bauer said told me he was the most difficult forward he had ever played against.
Well, the world would certainly be a better place if we had more Jean Belivos. He'll be missed. Our condolences to the Beliveau family. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Hockey Inside Out.